Hey everybody, my name is Alex, and this is Bento Radio. Now, before we get started into what we're talking about today, just some programming announcements and stuff like that. As always, you can follow me on social media at Alex Cohan everywhere, including Blue Sky. Blue Sky is probably the best place to follow me. It's the place I'm most regularly active if you want to hear from me or get at me in between episodes. You can also leave a comment below in the YouTube video, because there's going to be a YouTube video for every episode going forward for the foreseeable future, at least. If you haven't been watching the podcast, you can do that now. So, hooray for that. You can go to the link in the description of any episode, I believe, or at the very least in the description of the podcast proper if you're listening to it on a podcast app, whatever your favorite is. And there will be a link to the YouTube channel where you can check out basically all the episodes from season 2 so far. This is, I believe, episode 12, but there'll be episodes up from everything from as far back as the beginning of season 2. Like I said, just a few programming notes. I'm working on a place where all the stuff that I always talk about at the beginning of these podcasts will ultimately live. And in that vein, I will have more for that when I get a chance. And in that vein, like I said, I will probably put that in the description everywhere I can so you can go check out that central hub that I'm making. In addition, I'm going to be putting out some bonus stuff, and I'll be putting it out here on YouTube, but I might put it exclusively on that site from my old podcast, Lunchbox Radio. If you've ever heard me screw up the intro of this show and say Lunchbox at first instead of Bento Radio, that's why, because I used to have a podcast that ran for a very long time called Lunchbox Radio until I lost access to the back end of that podcast. Thank you, Spotify. But I have some episodes I want to carry over, mostly old, what I used to do, which was Sunday edition stuff, which is where I used to talk more about industry stuff. I used to separate that out. I have an interview with the director of the film program over at Japan Society in New York City. I have a couple other things that I want to put up, including my Anime NYC retrospective, which I'm going to try and get up sometime. 2024 retrospective, which I'm going to try and get up sometime soon. But on that note, for that fun jazz. And on that note, I'm actually going to be at Anime NYC time next week, really. This you're listening to this the day it comes out, I will have had my first full day at Anime NYC, and I'm not sure yet if I'm going to do it like a weekly thing or like daily thing like I always try to do, or if I'm just going to give up the ghost and do one big long podcast about Anime NYC like I did last year because of technical issues. But a whole bunch of plans. I'm not sure what will pan out and what won't. But out for that, not next week, but the week after, probably. Somewhere in that, like, we'll of course have an episode here at some level next week. But look out for coverage of Anime NYC 2025, because I've got a press badge and I'm coming. Going, rather. But on that note, you've included, let's jump into what I want to talk about today, and that's a called Shimoneta. I'm going to say this whole title. A boring world where the concept of dirty jokes doesn't exist. So I'm going to throw it over after that mouthful to Assistant I to give us a proper synopsis so we can dive into it straight away. So take it away, I.
In a dystopia.
The future, Japan. For decades, the law for public order and morals and healthy child raising has banned all sexual content. This law against libidinous language, in combination with the peacemaker surveillance technology, has turned what used to be an island nation of anything-goes sexual deviancy into the country with the healthiest public morality on earth. But among the douchey masses are subversives who would dare oppose this brave new world free of naughty thoughts. This is the story of these sick miscreants.
Cock and balls!
And now a word on socks. They champion what they mistakenly believe to be the right of all people to talk and joke about our bathroom areas. But they are misguided. In reality, socks are dirty. They are pervert terrorists.
Foreplay's over. Time to go all the way. Don't let them catch you, Tanukichi. We can't. Your brother wears leather. We will free the boys' cocks from the pains of chafing and their socks from the stains of jerking.
Seriously?
Did you boys enjoy receiving those facials? Stop filming! He can't broadcast this film! Get the feed!
About forbidden topics through
All
outrageous
right, our
and
rebellion has
comedic
begun.
acts of
Now it's time to say goodbye to this boring world where dirty jokes don't exist. From this day onward, things get titillating! Look at you, you're a real era terrorist. That should stroke your ego, and you should stroke what's between your legs.
excessive. And
Don't you feel the same magic filling your underpants, Mr. Okuma?
The series is a raunchy, absurdist comedy.
Now that we have the synopsis out of the way, so I want to frame this show and why I'm talking about this show, because last week I covered Brand New Animal, and a big reason I did it was because of all of the deeply dog whistly, eugenicsy commercials that were coming out. There was one famously for American Eagle jeans, and then there was one for Dunkin' Donuts, which was super out of left field. I'm not kidding. You can go look both of those commercials up. They exist. They're nightmares. And I felt this need to address it, and I do a lot of contextualization through what I watch and through media that I choose to watch or don't. Famously, I have tortured myself twice and watched Tanya the Evil because that show's really popular, but that show is also just about a little girl who's a Nazi, and I don't think this should probably exist because I'm not going to trust the notoriously media literate internet to deftly maneuver and understand that they are not glorifying those characters. But I realized I forgot to change my shot, but I'm going to do that right now, and I'm probably not going to cut this out. But that said, the reason I talked about Brand New Animal, you can go listen to and or watch the previous episode, either on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast, is that show is a show about existing as a biracial person in a real way. And a couple months ago at this point, I started, and then a few less months later finished my first season of a webcomic that I got in my head that I wanted to do, and just jump started, did 12 episodes over on Webtoons, and you can go find that webcomic in the description on the YouTube page or in any episode description. But one of the first, probably not one of the first, but one of the, actually I think maybe the first chapter I put out, or episode as they call them on Webtoon, that I put out, was a thing all about AlgoSpeak. And if you don't know what AlgoSpeak is, basically it's when you are talking to the algorithm, and I'm doing a version of it right now, when you're talking not to the algorithm, but on a platform about something, and you want to have the maximal reach, you use AlgoSpeak. You avoid certain words, you don't engage with certain ideas, you maneuver around it. But because so many of the ideas that people would want to talk about are maybe not agreeable, people come up with different algorithmic terms, unalive or CP or seg, SEGG, basically eggs with an S on front of it. And if you are listening to me, you completely know what I'm saying, and that's because the people doing this have created a vernacular that you understand. And my point about AlgoSpeak in what I was saying was, there are things you can't talk about on the internet anymore. If you want your post about something to do well, you have to play by this very specific set of rules. And what that's doing is it's limiting people's expression. And lots of people will say, well, aren't all of these companies, American companies, freedom of speech? That's not how that works. All the social media companies, from this one, YouTube, to any of the other ones, are private entities. They can do whatever they want or feel is necessary in terms of anything. And everything is guided to being advertiser safe. And there's a reason for that. You probably haven't seen any ads on my videos on YouTube, and that's because I just don't have a big enough follower base. But if you do, that becomes a valuable place where eyeballs go to, and you get served advertising because you're accessing YouTube for free, unless you pay for YouTube Premium, and then you don't see ads because you are no longer the product, you are actually the customer. Anytime that you're on social media, and this is a really common thing, you've probably heard it before, but anytime you're on social media and you are not paying money for the right to use that social media platform, you are the product that's being sold to advertisers somewhere in the background. Everything from, that's part of the reason why Twitter, now called X, although no one in their right mind called it X, has had such a rough go of it, because advertisers have just dropped out. They've said collectively, the audience that's on Twitter now, what's left of Twitter, is not worth our dollars for the agita we would have to put up for dealing with the Elon of it all. But if you look at Facebook, if you look at Instagram, if you look at YouTube, if you look at TikTok, any of it, there's stuff that they don't want to be next to, that advertisers don't want to be next to. And the way that all the platforms do it, I'm going through this for a reason, is that they rank anything that doesn't agree with that. And what you end up getting is a very cleaned up, sanitized version of people trying to still make impactful content, but this stuff they can't talk about intercourse. Even I'm struggling right now because I'm trying to follow the 15-minute rule of YouTube. I've got a timer up here. If you ever hear me stutter about 15 minutes into a YouTube show, it's because I'm into a podcast these days, because I'm trying to stick to the 15-minute rule of YouTube. I'm a little bit better at that because I am trained as a radio DJ, and the FCC has very strict rules around cursing on air, on the radio. A great movie that really super explains this awesomely, which is also a movie called Private Parts, which is all about the rise of Howard Stern. If you've ever wondered why Howard Stern is such a famous radio host, that explains it. It also lets you know why he's at Sirius XM, because Sirius XM does not care what you say on air, because they are not the same thing as the public broadcasting channels. And the long and short of the reason why he went to Sirius XM is because the stuff he was doing would end up impacting any radio station that he went on. Because at some point he was the highest, I think he was the highest paid, I don't know if they still is, but he was the highest paid radio DJ of all times at the time that he was experiencing he was in fights with the FCC. The FCC could have fined him any amount and it wouldn't matter. But what they were doing was they were starting to they would go over his head and finding the stations themselves. And he straight up said, I don't want to cause radio stations any agita for hiring me and me doing what I do, because people clearly like it. So I'm just going to go to a cable channel, essentially. And the equivalent of radio's HBO, Sirius XM. But what that does, and the reason why I'm talking about this in terms of Shimoneta, if you haven't really internalized this or you haven't seen this show, is what doing stuff like that does is it removes part of the vernacular of life, and it cleanses out all the dirty, inappropriate things that everybody talks about, but everybody says, you shouldn't talk about that in front of children, you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't do that. I was really stunned. We have an intern at my day job, and she told me some things about her health class, about standard reproductive health classes, that she just didn't get. And I was like, what do you mean you didn't get them? They taught us in 4th grade, dog. What do you mean? And she's like, they just didn't teach us. And the person did not go to a Catholic school. It's not like they taught abstinence or anything. she just didn't know. And I'm floored. I'm not so much floored, but I was really surprised because in my mind, that's a Catholic school move. When you cut off the access to that language, to that thought process, to those things, kids are going to find that stuff anyway. It's just how kids are. And the big problem is that eventually you get a bunch of kids who have real questions and nowhere to go even to satiate basic curiosity. Not even like, and by the way, I'm past the 15-minute mark, so I can say it now. Not even how do you have sex, but what is sex? A great example of this is, I'm going to give a bunch of anecdotes and stories throughout here because I think it's valuable to what this show is speaking to. And also say why I'm talking about this show in a second. But a great example is when I was not quite a camp counselor, but like a junior counselor in the sleepaway camp that I was in, parlance. We used to have to watch a cabin while all the full-fat counselors went and did a camp-wide meeting thing every Sunday. And I was just sitting in a cabin, keeping the kids company. The kids were pretty well behaved. And one kid looked directly at me and was like, "Alex, what's an orgy?" And I looked at, because we used to have a thing where if you got sent candy, it would get, with the kids were sent candy, it would get confiscated, and they would have what they called a candy orgy at the end of every week, where everybody's candy was easily distributed among all the campers. I never got why they called it a candy orgy, but whatever. I looked straight at him. For the reason I'm about to tell you, I never got why they called it candy orgy. I just said, "Group sex," and his eyes went wide. Oh, and it occurred to me in that moment, no adult has ever just told him this. I'm sure he asked me, but no adult has ever told him this. After long enough, especially now, if you don't tell people what stuff is, if you don't make it casual enough information where you can access it, you run the risk of kids, especially hormonal preteens and teenagers, going and finding their own answers on the internet. You can't scrub the internet of sexual content. That's just the way it goes. But in this show, there exists a world where essentially Japan had done that. And everybody wears these collars that keep track of everything they say, and it's this real nightmare fascist police state revolving around perversion and the curtailing of it. Now, the thing that got me thinking about the show that's almost completely in another direction, and that's a show that's happening right now that's become infamous because it just seems like filth, called Nukatashi, and it's based on a visual novel that is purely filth, but it has a little bit of the same vibe, but flipped on its head. And another show that is kind of related to this, and there's a pattern here that I'll explain after I give you the last show. A show called Interspecies Reviewers. And you're probably like, "Alex, why are you talking about the weird brothel show from 2020 that Funimation had to memory hole because they oopsed and didn't realize what they bought?" The reason why I'm talking about all three of these shows is because they all have a casualness and a shamelessness about lewd humor, sexuality. They bring the bar down on what sex is as a thing. And the reason why they bring the bar down is for cheap laughs. But I think there's something there. I mentioned in the episode before Brand New Animal about jobless reincarnation that one of the things that people say about creatives, particularly in anime, is the people who make the best art are always the weird perverts. And I don't think that's always necessarily true, but I think that we keep getting shows like this. We keep getting a Nukatashi. We keep getting a Shimoneta. We keep getting an Interspecies Reviewer. All the way back to things like Kekko Common. Not to mention all the hentai material out there. And the thing of it is that it exists for a reason. People are constantly going to look for it. The saying goes, sex sells. But with something like Shimoneta and something like Less so Interspecies Reviewers, although once again it is in that camp of like, we get an immensely perverse show once a season, although, and I'll deal with this in a second, Interspecies Reviewers is a little different. So is Nukatashi, clearly. The casualness that's there is just promotes an honesty and an understanding, and there's not a judgment there. And I'm not saying that every depraved weirdo is completely normal all the time. That's never true. As normal as you think you're not. You have some strong opinions about some weird shit. Trust me. Everybody does. But a lot of what people deem as morally incomprehensible or gross or that or the other thing is just societal. A perfect example. Actually, in the same year as Interspecies Reviewers, hilariously, I think it came out in 2020, there's this film called Cuties on Netflix. A couple years, I think in 2020. And I was woken up by an old friend from college by a multiple paragraph long, or the equivalent of multiple paragraph long text message, essentially saying that a mutual friend of ours had gone off on a diatribe about this film and about how it oversexed young girls and teenage girls and all this other stuff. And she was like, I don't, like, this seems insane. It seems insane, but I'm not sure she's wrong. What's the deal here? You seem like a totally logical person. Can you help me logic my way through this? And what I essentially said was, she's probably not wrong. People are probably not wrong. It probably does all the things that people are worried about. But the reason that people are worried about it is because they want to pretend that that age group doesn't have those thoughts. They don't. The thing that happens, especially to guys, when you turn 18 and no one around you does. And I know this because I was a year behind in school because the American school system is cursed, essentially. But I turned 18 and I was still in high school, and basically nobody else did. And in my mind, I'm like, well, everybody in my entire class is completely undateable because I'm of age, they're not. I passed the age of consent, they're not. And that's a big concern, especially for young men, because there is a history of you're dating a girl and you're a year old, and she's 17, you're 18, or she's 16, you're 18. The kind of age gaps that don't matter before or after the 18-year-old line. And somebody doesn't like you doing that, a father figure, a mother figure, a what have you, and reports you. And now you're on a registry. Now your life is screwed up. And what that chilling effect makes basically any guy think about it twice, especially guys, because that's the target of it constantly. But that's not to say that people under the age of consent don't have thoughts about this. Part of the way I opened this up was we had sex ed in 4th grade. They dragged us in, they taught us about our own gender, and then they dragged us in again and taught us about the opposite gender. And it got really weird for a month there. But the reason they did that was because they knew, studies show that you gotta teach them about this stuff early. High school is probably too late. If you don't give the answers in time, people go out and find their own answers. People go out and find their own and make their own context for everything. There's all kinds of reports about younger kids of all genders, of any gender under the sun, getting the wrong idea about intimacy from material on the internet. And that being their formative experience with how it all works. And there's lots of material from the adult industry trying to wind that back even, which is crazy. Being like, this is performative. It's not real. If you want to do this stuff in real life, great, get consent. Everybody should be above board about it. It shouldn't be this big. You shouldn't assume that everybody's on board with this stuff. This stuff is extreme for a reason. And shows like Shimoneta and the other ones I talked about, ostensibly Shimoneta is arguing for the right for the population to be able to access porn again. Be able to access porn, be able to talk dirty, be able to tell dirty jokes, all that stuff. But what its ultimate point is, and what the point of Nukatashi is the elevating of sex in either direction makes it this big, scary, important thing. When really it could be much simpler, and it could be much more ground level and much less, what's the best word for it? Much less obsessive. I'm going to talk about a character in Jobless Reincarnation, because I've been listening to Jobless Reincarnation light novels for incessantly as a way to avoid the news. But anyway, the character in Jobless Reincarnation, there's a lot of characters in Jobless Reincarnation who are total horn dogs. But there's a specific character in Jobless Reincarnation named Elena Lise. She is a perpetually cursed elf who basically has to get it on, not constantly, but essentially once a day in order to stay alive. And that has caused, that plus a unique blend of her personality and living for a really long time because the character is an elf, has created this person who is incredibly casual about intimacy, about sex, about all of it, in a way that no one else in the show quite is. And because of the way the show is set up, it doesn't pay her this lascivious eye. When you in the actual show, it's set up as this lurid moment at first, and then it just exists. And pretty quickly, they get you to a point with that character of just like, oh yeah, she's waving at you from the window, but she's getting it currently. And the main character, Rudy, is just like, oh hey, maybe take that inside. You might get a cold. Please don't get a cold. And just like that casualness and that lack also provides a lack of judgment and a lack of shame, because I think a lot of people's hang-ups in the world is they feel shame in some way for their preferences or their, I don't want to say kinks, but that's a word, but like their preferences and kinks, basically. And these shows, specifically Shimoneta, it does its best to be like, no, sometimes there's just incredibly horny girls who are completely okay with that. And there's a character in the show who is a nightmare named Anna Nishiki no Miya, and she's clearly really repressed. The show's world has put her in a place where she has to be really repressed and really a pillar of society and can't be a way that she wants to be a way that she could be. And that repression bubbles over, essentially. It becomes a major problem. She essentially tries to assault the main character, Okama, because she just doesn't know, she doesn't have any context for what to do with the violent lust she feels. She has no outlet for it. And a lot of that is because she has no context for it. The thing that will sanitizing effect that's happening with the internet right now because of all the child safety laws that are going to cause you have to input your driver's license or ID to access anything with any adult material on it, which is way more than you think, by the way. Every music streaming service, Reddit for sure, YouTube for sure, basically anything where a thirst trap or a hot tub gaming video could be, all of that is going to be behind some sort of barrier in some way. Only that stuff is also art. And the thing that's kind of missed in Shimoneta is a lot of the art you like. Not even art considered to be gross or pornographic or any of that stuff. Features naked women. Are we supposed to put friggin' electrical tape over all the naked women in the Louvre or all the naked women in the Met? That's not going to go well. And the thing that I'm always wary of is if people have a pre-fascination with this stuff who want to restrict this stuff, I always want to ask the question, why? Because it's not that big a deal, and yes, there is a certain amount of harm that comes from abusing these forms of adult entertainment. But what if, I'm going to have a scenario here, because somebody was 13 and not of age and not 18, they were looking for some kind, they had these feelings that they weren't standard issue straight, that they weren't a cis straight person. What if they couldn't have access to any version of representation other than the blandest, straightest, unromantic existence, because anything that was considered queer is considered to be sexual in nature by whoever makes the decision. And a lot of both Shimoneta and a lot of Shimoneta rather is about the fact that the people making the decisions have made a lot of decisions that have cut people off from representation and expressing their unclean thoughts in a safe way and a controlled environment, and having a space to experiment and see what they like and don't like. Because when you don't have that, bigger problems pop up. And I'm not saying people can get assaulted on the streets, but I am saying that you'll get a group of people who don't know how to be when push comes to shove. When a date goes well and you go back to one or the other's apartment. Knowing what you like is as valuable as knowing about it at all. And Shimoneta is about the right to explore that stuff without someone else looking over your shoulder and being like, you can't. Because that's so much of what the show's about. And so much of what... And the interesting thing is, when the kerfuffle around Interspecies Reviewers happened 5 years ago, in 2020 apparently, it caught the entire anime industry in America by surprise. Because, essentially, to boil it down to a digestible, long and short, basically, when companies license shows, sometimes they've only seen a certain amount of the show just to know that it exists, and they pay for it. And Interspecies Reviewers was a highly anticipated show that has an ecchi manga. The manga does not look like the show does on a lot of levels. And there are all kinds of rules which I completely understand and make complete sense about putting adult material in a place where children can access. I'm not even talking about preteens. I'm talking about any kid in the single digit range even. But also, you probably shouldn't be watching something like Interspecies Reviewers if you're under the age of 18. But the show ended up being essentially porn with extra steps in a real way. And it got memory hold from the internet because Funimation freaked out. They did not make it to episode 3 even. And they disappeared it from the internet largely. And then when the show had concluded its run wherever it was, I think it was left streaming. The only place it was left streaming was a place called Anime Now in Australia. But people were posting illegal subs of it all over the place. You could complete that show in a timely manner if you so chose. It got a steelbook. I have the steelbook. And many people like me who maybe didn't even love that show. The show's fine. It's a little insane, but it's fine. Got the steelbook, did the $100 edition pre-order thing, because we had this sneaking suspicion they might not print this again. It might not be a thing that's available in America ever again, because it ran up against FCC guidelines and all this other stuff. It might be that nobody wants to touch this thing ever again. And then, hilariously, I haven't checked on the price lately, but last I checked, it cost a lot of money to get even the steelbook, let alone the steelbook with the pack-in production art book, which I also have, which is really nice, actually. But because Funimation got bought a bunch of times, Sony got bought a bunch of times, in general, you've been seeing this purge of adult material across the internet because of the upcoming child protection laws and ID nonsense that's about to happen. There was just a thing that happened with itch.io and with Steam, where all of the games that seemed even remotely adult-oriented just vanished from both. Eventually, Crunchyroll buys not only Funimation, where the show originally was, but Right Stuff, the distributor of the original Steelbook release in America, largely. And then all the stuff that was on Right Stuff, of which there was lot because Right Stuff, in their, to their credit, was rated art. If you don't like the fact that some art is also porn, kick rocks. Which I always thought was great and is the correct answer when it comes to any kind of art. Because they had new ownership and because they didn't want to deal with the same kinds of things that Right Stuff was willing to deal with, Right Stuff's over 18 adult section split off into a whole different site called buyAnime.com. I'm not kidding. It exists. And actually, from what I understand, has become the new version of Right Stuff on some level, but it's significantly more adult-oriented. I haven't looked at it in a while. But all that stuff, if you were paying attention there, there's a big purge of adult material from the internet. And yes, we should be careful about exposing kids to this, and yes, we should be providing context. But a lot like the way that kids who got very little access to alcohol in high school end up getting blackout drunk in college, kids are going to have questions. Young people are going to have questions. They have feelings that anybody who's listening to this who's older, you know what the hormones felt like. I certainly remember. It's awful. Puberty occurs to you and you got to deal with it. And it would be so much better if you could go to your parent figure and be like, hey, I have these feelings, I don't know what to do with them. And your parent was like, here's context, here's a safe way to engage with this, come back with more questions. There's a couple great examples of this in popular media. In the show Weeds, and they all are entertainment oriented, so they all go bad eventually. But because they're still trying to make you watch, and once again, sex sells, and they want something like scandalous and whatever. But in a show from Showtime called Weeds, I think Shane, the youngest character, he goes through puberty, and these young boys in puberty and learn about their body by hook or by crook. And a character named Andy just sits him down. So the maid has been finding a lot of stiff socks. Here's some alternatives. He asks me questions, all this stuff, and it's comedic, sure, and the places that goes isn't great at the very end, but it's so much more open and so much more honest than what a lot of people experience when it comes to abstinence is the only answer, all this other stuff. There's a great movie called Saved that's about a girl in high school really struggling with growing up and becoming an adult and a bunch of stuff. But a lot of that is also about her relationship to sex and intimacy. It's got Macaulay Culkin in it, in a real banner role for him, which is great. And it has a lot to say about shame and why you shouldn't feel shame and coming to your own conclusions, but only with enough information. And it features a lot of her bumbling through what is pretty standard intimacy and sexual activity stuff because she just doesn't have the tools. And the way you don't get the tools is by cutting off all access to all answers. And the way that happens, the way that starts, is by cutting off the access to adult material at first, and then all the other stuff gets caught up in the net. One of the things that is happening in the UK, I believe, is that users can't get on to Reddit threads that has information about periods because that's sexual in nature. But it's not about go out and become the town bike or become the town doorknob, to use a sexual innuendo. It's about reproductive health. It's about your health. What happens when you look up, why is my pee red? Why am I peeing blood? That's also sexual health. It has to do with your sexual organs, all that stuff. This stuff all gets caught in the same thing, but also, once again, there's this level of shame about, it's very puritanical, and yes, it's also oftentimes very American. There's this level of shame about sexuality and about talking about it and about approaching it that all of these super lewd and perverse shows, and sometimes in the case of Nukatashi, or in the case of both Nukatashi and Interspecies Reviewers, but not Shimoneta, are just out and out pornographic at some point are talking about and are having a conversation about and are aware of. And in Nukatashi's case, it's part of the joke, but it is a way into talking about real intimacy and real connection with a partner and all this stuff. And that's so much of what that show ends up being about by episode 3. I just watched episode 3 morning of me recording this. But in the case of Shimoneta, it's about regaining access to that vocabulary and regaining access to that part of life. So maybe the level of shame people feel about those thoughts can be dealt with in a real way. And you can't deal with it by just being like, nope, put it in a box and don't let people see it. Because people are going to think about it. That's the whole point and problem that people really felt in my mind about that film. From what I understand, was not even that good. Beauties is that people didn't want to think about the fact that a 13, 14-year-old kid, particularly a 13, 14-year-old girl, has thoughts about that stuff. Has real contextualized thoughts about that stuff. I don't know why we're surprised the amount of sexualized everything that's everywhere is so pervasive, even barring just sexual material. Have you ever seen a Carl's Jr. ad from the 90s or the early 2000s? It's no surprise that a 12-year-old has some real thoughts about that. Because it's there. And it will be there whether you want it to be or not. So why try and hide it and make it more complicated to get at than, hey, are you 18? Or a meaningful check. But the kids who have questions about this stuff, who are looking for this stuff, will be of age at some point. Every teenage boy who has ever existed will, barring something awful, eventually turn 21 and be able to just walk into a strip club. It's just true. Will turn, in the same way they'll turn 18 and be able to buy cigarettes of their own accord. So one of the interesting things about jobless reincarnation, which has a whole range of the way people feel about it, and I keep coming back to it because once again, I am reading the light novels through to the conclusion, apparently. I've become possessed by them, basically. Is that in that show's world, the age someone's considered an adult, essentially the age of consent, so to speak, is 15. And the show tells you that, and then proceeds to behave that way. It acts as if 15 is 18. And it just tells it, like, you see characters who are clearly, like, teenagers, but functioning in adult life. And part of that is this gross wish fulfillment, I'm sure. Once again, many times great art comes from weird perverts. But the other thing is that it really does is it gives you context. And it says, we're contextualizing this way because that was probably how it was. In the medieval sword and sorcery environment that the show takes place in, and that the show's setting is based on, certainly, princesses used to be married off at impossibly early ages. Daughters used to be married off at impossibly early ages. Over time, we realized, hey, that's not right. This is bad, this is gross, this is weird and bad. We gotta up that line to make it feel more right and more fair. But that doesn't mean it didn't happen. But the other thing that's true is those characters, and they do a pretty good job of this in the book, in the light novel series, they show those that the younger characters, and lots of anime shows this, have unclean thoughts, have weird leaps of logic. Like, to the light novel's credit, the main character, who's deeply unjudgmental because of his background in his previous life, sits a couple characters down. Hey, that's not how that goes. You should reel it back, bud. And it comes to a head a couple times, from what I understand, because I've seen spoilers later on in the story. But he also approaches it without being shameful. The last anecdote I'll offer here is from a place that I don't pull from very often, and I'm surprised that I pulled from it all. But At some point in the Kardashians, Kris Jenner has this conversation with the camera, with the candid interview format, about the fact that Khloe came to her when Khloe was like 15 and was like, I really like this guy. I've been going out with him for a long time. I think I'm ready. I think I want to sleep with him. And instead of just being like, oh my God, no, you're too young. Instead of Kris pushing that idea immediately out of her head, she was like, this is how you be safe. And so much of us removing the context of trying to remove the shame around sexuality and kinks and the whole 9 yards that Shimoneta is dealing with leads to a universe in which more and more people don't do that with their kids. When their kids do confide in them in that way, they don't stand and first say, hey, are you sure? You're clearly sure. That and the other thing, here's how you do this safely. Here's all this other stuff that contextualizes what is good and bad about the choice you're about to make. Because eventually they'll make the choices and you'll never know. Or by the time it'll be way too late. Or way past the fact. What Shimoneta ends up is not about the dirty jokeness. That's where the comedy comes from, but it's about the ability to indulge in that without it having to feel secretive and gross and inappropriate, because it's appropriate in the middle of the day. The main character, Ame Kujo, is an insane person, but she's what you get when you cut off total access, which, for the record, in Japan would be insane. So I went to Japan a while ago. I've talked about this before on the podcast. But you walk through not just like Tokyo. I saw it less in Kyoto, because Kyoto is different. It's like built different. It's like a thing that's built significantly differently. Kyoto feels less closed in when you're on the streets. But in Tokyo and Osaka, walking on the street, you see these horizontal signs that just say DVD. And oftentimes they'll say DVD and VR. And those are just like, we've got booths where you can watch filthy shit in all kinds of arrangements in strange ways. And also there's the entire soapland culture of Japan. There's the entire pink industry of Japan, which soaplands are a part of. Removing all of that would be insane. And I'm sure there are obviously still problems with the context of all this stuff, but the attitude around it is so much less restrained and so much less shameful than you would ever expect. It is certainly sexist, I want to be clear. But so I stay in a hotel called the Washington Hotel in Akihabara. The way I would get to the main part of Akihabara when I was staying there is I would go through this tiny underpass tunnel thing. I love to sing the Avatar Secret Tunnel song as I was walking through. I probably look like an insane person. I would just go, secret tunnel, as I walk through, and you would be immediately met by L-shaped alley and big old anime billboards. But immediately under that was just a sex shop. And then giant one, and because, once again, Japan is incredibly sexist, it was also one of the only sex shops that I saw that was like, hey, we don't care what gender you are, you're allowed in here, whatever. Guys, take notes, your girlfriends can finally come in and see your gross bullshit. But there was also a multiple story sex shop, and they were both multiple story, but a different multiple story one. Women just weren't allowed above floor 4. And that attitude gives a lot less, it gives a kind of casualness to that part of society that makes it feel less daunting and less terrifying. And that's really what will happen if something like Shimoneta happens. And something like Shimoneta could absolutely happen. Under a lot of the background context of Shimoneta is that, yes, the dirty jokes that are happening, the dirty joke restriction and the morality laws are happening, are only part of it. More of it is this weird fascist nightmare state that everyone exists in because of those laws. And I thought it was a really interesting thing to talk about, considering what's happening with all the child safety laws and what's coming for the internet by all accounts, of all the ID checks and all this other stuff, because there will be other things caught up in that. It's not even just about the fact the government building a big old database about everybody. They could already do that. I used to work for a ad tech company. I can tell you, they have stuff on you already. But the loss of access to particularly reproductive health stuff, things that, content that assures you you're okay. You're not so weird that this preference doesn't exist. You're not so weird that as a queer person you're okay. As somebody who likes something that's alternative, you're okay. The loss of access to that stuff is a big deal. And yes, Shimoneta may play it for laughs, but what if a girl like Anna exists and she in reality and doesn't know what to do with the feeling she has for somebody and ends up incredibly depressed and incredibly frustrated and doesn't know where to point that stuff. I'm not saying she would assault somebody. I'm not saying that would or should ever happen. But I am saying that there's a potential of misplaced and misunderstood feelings that exist even when we have a way to contextualize it, when we have ways to just straight up blow off steam, to, in the case of many guys, go to sleep. Imagine when that stuff doesn't, when even that doesn't exist. When all of a sudden the idea of being intimate with somebody is a complete unknown and you have nothing at your fingertips to be like, what does this even functionally look like? Because that stuff will get caught up in it too. It already has. Or when the only thing taught in schools is abstinence, which would be insane and bad. But on that note, if you like, this is where I'm going to end it. If you like the show, new episodes of the podcast come out every Thursday. I will be going to Anime NYC next week. I don't know what I'm going to talk about, but I'm going to have to do it early because I'll have to get a train and all that stuff. But you can also follow me over on Blue Sky at Alex Holt Cohan. Also on Instagram if you want to, although I'm less active on Instagram. You can also follow me on Threads, actually. Those are usually the three I do lately. You can find the webtoon that I do over on Webtoons. Is called Bullshit News, or by looking in the description wherever you're getting this podcast into you. If you want to put it in your eyeballs, you can go over YouTube and search Bento Radio. It should come up. If you want to listen to it, you can go to your podcast app of choice. And if you can hear me, you can subscribe to it. And I encourage you to do so. On that note, I have been Alex. This has been Bento Radio, and I'll talk to you later.